evening and welcome to the Border Zone Projects. Today we discuss recent developments in Georgia and in the United States, both in regard with COVID-19 pandemic and political situation. And my guest is Director of Biden's Center, Mr. Michael Karpenther. Hello.
Hi, Егор. Good to be with you.
Thanks a lot for taking part. Could you please first tell me how are you there? Because we hear lots of news about the pandemic in the United States. Isn't it getting better or not?
Well, it really depends on where you are. So we're doing fine here in Washington and things seem to be fairly stable here. But in different parts of the country, you have different stories. Some parts of the US are opening up and things seem okay. Other places are seeing an increase in cases. So it's a patchwork here.
For you, it's fine?
For me, it's fine. Yes, thanks for asking.
Very good. I would like, before we talk a bit about what's going on in the United States, I would like to ask, because I know that you're following developments in Georgia as well. And almost a year ago, we discussed with you different kind of economical issues in regard with US-Georgia cooperation. If you followed recent developments and reactions from the United States, I'm interested whether you know, is Georgia now really on the table in Washington, D.C.? Is it some kind of issue discussed there? Because we saw reactions from Congress, from Senate. So whether you are discussing Georgia there?
Yeah, I think Georgia is on the agenda here. It is not obviously issue number one. Everybody here is preoccupied with the COVID-19 pandemic, as they should be. And so generally speaking, foreign relations have taken a backseat to domestic news over the last couple months. But that's with regards to everything from North Korea to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to you name it. Everything has taken a backseat. But Georgia is still in the attention of a select number of congressmen and senators who care about that part of the region, of the world.
Could you please tell me, what does it mean if even in regard, even during the pandemic, when everyone, of course, are busy with much maybe more important issues, the head of Foreign Affairs Committee of the Senate made statements about Georgia every week. Some congressmen make these statements. And even I think you saw it, there was a statement saying that Congress and Senate members asked State Secretary Pompeo to discuss current situation in Georgia and some kind of connections between Georgian ruling party head Mr. Байдена Ivanishvili with the Kremlin. What is your understanding of this process, and do you evaluate this situation like that?
Well, both the House and the Senate Foreign Relations Committees pay close attention to the countries in their mandate. So, you have the subcommittees, for example, on Europe, which includes Georgia, where you have staff who are heavily focused on Georgia and on developments there and what's happening. So despite the pandemic, you do have people commenting and trying to ensure that the situation in Georgia, geopolitically speaking, is on the right track from our perspective, of course, from the Washington perspective. So you do have people who are interested and who are quite vocal, actually, in terms of opining about recent developments, both the March 8th agreement on reducing political tensions, but then also various economic issues have come up of late.
How do you see the situation? Do you have your opinion in regard with what is going on in Georgia? Because what I see and some experts in Georgia see that relations between the United States and Georgian government, let's say not Georgia, is getting worse. Do you agree with that?
Well, so if you had asked me that question about 6 months ago, I would have said certainly yes. I would have said that generally speaking, the relationship was in a state of deterioration and things were getting worse. Right now, I think there's actually some light at the end of the tunnel. It still remains to be seen how everything plays out. But the sheer fact that we got an agreement on March the 8th that will bring Georgia's polarized political spectrum together, rallied around this notion of having changes to the Constitution, to the administration of elections that will give the opposition a fair shot in the October elections, is a huge positive breakthrough. And, you know, there have been other steps taken, like, for example, the pardoning of Mr. Uglava and Mr. Okrashvili. You know, I would personally like to see Georgi Rurua pardoned as well. But already we've seen positive steps trying to depoliticize, defuse the environment in Georgia, and that is a positive thing. So whereas 6 months ago things didn't look so good, I think right now things are looking much, much better, and they continue, I hope, to be on that path. And then last thing I'll say is that Georgia has really shown a lot of maturity and leadership in handling the COVID-19 pandemic. It's really one of the case studies of proper management. And that surely has gotten the attention of people here in Washington as well.
That's very good. Yeah, I have to admit that in Georgia, we're very lucky to be here during this pandemic because the situation is quite fine. Let's move to United States. And could you please, because propaganda is attacking the West in general and United States particular in regard with COVID-19 pandemic. How would you evaluate how United States government deal with this pandemic, with economical situation? Because as I know, you have a huge problem now with jobs and some economical crisis in general. So according to your understanding, is it like positive experience or negative experience?
The United States has completely botched its response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what's played out here has been a real tragedy because this is one of the wealthiest countries on earth. Our medical system, although there are huge inequalities between the rich and poor in this country in terms of access to healthcare, the healthcare facilities themselves and the sophistication of the medical services that are provided in the US are second to none. And so it's been a real tragedy to watch as so much time was squandered in responding to this pandemic, and that the Trump administration has been so ham-fisted in terms of its refusal to this very day, until today, to take measures to actually halt the spread of the virus and to accelerate mitigation measures such as the stockpiling of personal protective equipment, ventilators, face masks, and so on and so forth. Had there been a strong concerted move by the federal government to respond as soon as we knew that the virus was inside this country, we would have been on a much different trajectory than we are. Right now, the United States has the #1 caseload in the world and the #1 fatality caseload in the world. And that is unfortunate. It did not have to be that way. And unfortunately, I think it will continue in this negative direction because the federal government here has refused to step in. It has refused to act. It has left all the decision-making to the states. And that has produced a rather chaotic situation because
it actually sounds like in Russia, where
it's very much like
Putin...
Putin's approach. First, there was a denial that the pandemic was a threat or that it was significant, just as Mr. Putin did in Russia. And then there was this desire to devolve all decisions to regional officials so that the federal government would somehow be, I don't know, I guess they were calculating it would be immune to criticism. But it's just the opposite. By failing to act, they have really set this country on a horrific path. Just as in Russia, we have seen Russia, of course, has the second highest caseload of any country in the world. Or Brazil,
yeah, but
Brazil is another example.
As I know, and as we always like here in America, you have very strong institutions, and even if federal government or president's administration is not maybe very efficient in some cases, where are these institutions?
Well, that's right. So the institutions here really depend on good leadership at the top. The institutions do not take care of themselves. They do not. The Centers for Disease Control in the United States are very sophisticated. But if they are ignored by the president of the United States, if he does not command that they do certain things that are in his purview, then even having very strong institutions is not going to help. And, you know, the United States also, we suffered from the fact that we were one of the first countries to have a lot of travelers come here with COVID from both Italy and from China. So part of the problem was that we were just simply one of the first countries to suffer from the disease. But that timing was compounded then by the horrific political decisions made by Mr. Trump and his top advisors.
What's about economy? What is the situation? Do you believe that the government and ministries will find a way to deal with this issue? Because as I've heard today or yesterday, that in America, it's about 11% of people who lost their jobs at the moment.
It's higher. It's closer to 15%. And look, I think no one should be under any illusions that we're not going to have a global recession in the coming years, because this is going to spread around the world. It's not going to be localized to just one economy or another. But the U.S. has been particularly poor in its economic response because President Trump has created this false dichotomy. He has said, on the one hand, you could open the economy and we could have growth, and maybe we'll suffer more deaths, more cases, but we'll have economic growth. On the other hand, you could shut everything down and save more lives, but then the economy will plummet further. But that is a completely false choice. That is not the way that this works. If we were to contain the virus first and then open up our economy, we would be much better positioned to both decrease the number of cases and then to have economic growth, as various countries like Germany or Austria or Taiwan or South Korea or New Zealand have done. So the models of good governance are out there. And unfortunately, compared to those countries, we have failed in the United States. It's really a tragedy that this country has fallen so low.
Why did you, not you, I mean, but Washington bought this so-called aid from Russia for $600,000? You didn't have needed equipment.
Well, you know, early on, we thought that maybe we did need the equipment, but this was a classic case of President Trump succumbing to Putin's propaganda and his incessant, never-ending desire to please Putin at all costs. People really have to ask themselves, what is at the root of this relationship? Why does this president, why does he bend over backwards time and time again to please a dictator like Vladimir Putin? It was a ridiculous stunt to deliver this equipment. And now, of course, the United States is sending ventilators to Russia because, of course, they need them, because they completely lied about the number of cases in their country, even when everyone knew that it was spreading across the Russian landmass. And so now we're sending them back. Of course, I assume that the United States is not going to charge Russia for those ventilators the way they charged us.
Could you please tell me, how did in the United States change the political situation? Because as I know, before COVID-19 pandemic, President Trump was like the leader in regard with upcoming elections in the United States. Did this situation change, and these efforts implemented by the governments when they supported, as I know, each citizen, and they gave them like $3,000 or something like this, or 1,000
up to 2,000. Yeah,
up to 2,000. Do you think it was efficient? Is it connected with upcoming elections? And how did it change the environment?
Well, it was, I don't think it was connected to the upcoming elections, although I think you may see another disbursement of aid in October, timed to coincide with the elections. But it was insufficient, and it was the wrong approach for a variety of reasons. The right approach in a situation like this is the approach of countries like Denmark or the United Kingdom that have created a fund to subsidize companies that furlough their workers. That creates an incentive for companies not to fire people, but to keep them as their employees and simply to put them on furlough. And the government pays, 75 or 80%, it varies by country, but a certain percentage of their salaries. That's the way to prevent massive economic collapse. Instead, what the US has done is classic stimulus spending. They've given every citizen a check, depending on their income, up to $2,000. But that doesn't prevent companies from firing people, and that doesn't prevent this vicious circle of unemployment caused by firings and then reduced demand to undermine our economy. So we are spiraling right now into a depression. we're about to enter a recession, and then, in my view, it's going to get much worse, and it'll be a full-blown depression before long, because we've adopted this wrong, short-sighted approach. If you look at the United Kingdom, they have done very poorly responding to the disease, but their economic measures have been much more solid than ours.
Yeah, but how do you evaluate these processes in regard with upcoming elections? Do you think that Trump is still a leader or not?
Well, so with regard to Trump's popularity, it has suffered. There was initially sort of a rally around the flag effect because the disease was ravaging communities around the United States. And whenever that you have a tragedy of this proportion, it is natural for citizens to sort of rally around their leader. And so you saw a little bit of that. And then, you know, I think in the last 4 weeks or so, you've started to see people really question Trump's leadership, even amongst those with whom he is popular. Particularly his comments, his ridiculous comments that citizens in the US should consider ingesting bleach into their bodies, drinking bleach or injecting it to deal with the virus. You know, it's the stuff of witch doctors. It's really, it's just, I can't even believe I'm saying it, that this came out of the lips of the mouth of the president of the United States. But you know, that has reduced a lot of faith in his leadership. And so right now there's recently a Quinnipiac poll that shows that in a head-to-head matchup right now between Biden and Trump, Biden leads Trump by about 11 points. Now, you know, this is the middle of May, and we've got a long ways to go before the election. So I'm sure there's going to be lots of different things happening, and lots of propaganda and disinformation as well that Trump will put out. But for now, at least, he's suffering.
Yeah, you said about propaganda and disinformation. It was maybe the last issue I wanted to briefly discuss with you. Will you agree, first of all, that this pandemic was the widest, huge reason for China and Kremlin to start disinformation and propaganda campaigns? What is the situation in this regard in the United States? Because here in Georgia, it's huge. And first of all, against American lab, Lugo lab. So how would you evaluate Russian and Chinese influence in regard with COVID-19 pandemic in the United States and against United States partners?
So the propaganda has been relentless, but there's two different types of propaganda. The first is propaganda that tries to portray China and Russia as responsible leaders who are coping with the pandemic well. And on that front, I think the Russians have failed miserably. The Chinese have done much better. And then there are attacks on the United States for sure, showing poor global leadership. For example, threatening to cut funding to the World Health Organization. And that propaganda has been more effective. But then there's a whole separate second category of propaganda that is even more insidious. And that is propaganda within the United States that tries not to have any Russian or Chinese fingerprints on it, but that is aimed at convincing people that COVID-19 isn't really a threat, that they don't need to get vaccinated for it when a vaccine is finally developed. And as you know, there is a strong anti-vax movement in the United States, also in other countries like Italy or Germany. And so we're seeing that there is both indigenous propaganda that cultivates this set of issues, but that the Russians are also glomming onto this and trying to accelerate this because it weakens America, because it decreases faith in our medical system, in our leadership. And so that type of propaganda, I fear, is going to be far more dangerous than the propaganda that says China's great, the US is not great. Because that's
Do you believe that United States and maybe European Union, like the so-called West, will go out from this pandemic stronger, maybe in regard not with like economical situation, but bilateral relations, unions, and etc., like maybe more united or weakened?
Well, I think that chapter is yet to be written. I think we have to wait and see. I've said from the beginning of this pandemic that this is not something that's going to privilege democracies or autocracies. It's really going to depend on individual leadership. But if you look at the good responses to this virus, what are the countries that have done best in containing the virus, in gradually restarting their economies on safe terms? You look at countries like Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, the Nordic countries. These are all democracies. So generally speaking, I think democracies have done well. The worst countries are those that are populist. Brazil, the United States. And it doesn't matter whether they're democracies or autocracies, but whenever you have populist leaders that just want to gain popularity and they are willing to say ridiculous things like President Bolsonaro in Brazil, then you have disastrous outcomes.
I hope that the situation will become a bit better in the United States because like the post-Soviet space needs some support and be together in our challenges we face here. So would you say that this crisis will like finish in United States soon? Because in Europe, it's already like near the end.
Well, I don't agree with you that it's near the end in Europe, because I think we're going to see a second wave of the disease in the fall that is going to be worse than the first wave. That was what happened in 1918 and 1919 with the Spanish flu pandemic. The second wave was much worse than the first wave. So I think everybody is fooling themselves if they think that the virus is going to go away this summer and then that's it. We're home free. We're not home free. In the US, I think things are going to get worse because this president has shown that he's completely incapable of providing steady leadership in response to this crisis. And so unless we see a change of leaders in the fall, I think things in the United States are only going to get worse from here on out. There will be a slight improvement over the summer months because the research has shown that the virus is less likely to spread in the summer than during the winter and the fall when it's colder. But come October, come November, I think we're in for a real wallop. And not just the US, but the whole world.
Can we say, the last question, can we say that in regard with what you just said, yes, the world is now discussing the second wave of pandemic. Can we say that all conflicts that we had before, like 2 months ago, 3 months ago, I mean, Kremlins, China, Iran, and etc., are on the second or third level now, and the pandemic will just close all of these issues for some long period?
Well, I don't think so. I think we have to pay attention to both at the same time because, frankly, the authoritarian powers like the ones you mentioned, like especially China, because it is best positioned to attack Western democracies right now. Russia is suffering itself right now from a very mismanaged pandemic. But China will continue to attack us. And, you know, every authoritarian country that will try to seek an advantage out of this crisis. And so this is not a second order issue. It has to be addressed, and democracies have to stand together. What I find the number one issue that keeps me up at night, that just has me pounding my head against a wall, is the fact that Trump has so neglected and undercut America's traditional allies, especially in Europe. But also in East Asia. And so, you know, if we were united, if we adopted this common approach to fighting the pandemic and also to fighting authoritarian powers and countering their malign influence, we would be so much better positioned than we are today, where we're fractured and we're divided, and Trump can't even agree on a simple communique with his G7 partners because he antagonizes them at every single turn. It's just a tragedy.
I wish you all the best during this very difficult period, and thanks a lot for this interview.
Yeah, I wish my friends in Georgia well too.
Thank you. Thank you.